The knock came at 7:14 on a Thursday evening. 3 knocks. Deliberate, slow. I was standing at my stove, water boiling, garlic in the pan. My twins were at the table behind me, Sophie drawing, Owen pressing a bottle cap into clay. A perfectly normal night. I opened the door, and my entire world stopped. Elliot Prescott was standing in my driveway. The man I divorced 5 years ago, the billionaire who signed our papers without looking at me. The man I had not spoken to in 5 years, 4 months, and 11 days. He was holding an envelope. Inside that envelope was a photograph of me, holding my twins, the twins he never knew existed. I stood at that door and I felt the ground move under my feet, because the secret I had carried alone every single night for 5 years was over. It was standing right in front of me in a charcoal coat, looking at me with an expression I had never once seen on his face during our entire marriage. And the worst part, the most terrifying part, was not that he had found out. It was that I didn't know yet whether I had made the right choice. 5 years, 2 children, one decision made in the darkest moment of my life. And now I was going to find out what it cost. Stay with me. Because this story is not just mine. This is a story about what happens when you protect the people you love the only way you know how, and then have to face the world you were hiding from. It is about survival, about rebuilding, about the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who refused to disappear. If this story speaks to something you have carried, something heavy, something private, something you have never quite been able to explain to anyone, then this channel is for you. Hit like if you are staying. Leave a comment with one word that describes how you feel right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because every story we tell here is built for women who are stronger than they have been given credit for. Now, let me tell you everything.
The knock came at 7:14 in the evening. 3 of them. Deliberate, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that knows you're home. Grace Harmon was at the stove when she heard it. The pasta water was boiling. The kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil, and the particular warmth of a Thursday evening in October that has gone exactly right. Sophie was at the table behind her, narrating a drawing with the intensity of a documentary filmmaker. Owen was pressing a bottle cap into a piece of clay, slow and methodical, the way he did everything. Grace wiped her hands on the dish towel. She walked to the door. She opened it. Elliot Prescott was standing in her driveway. She had not seen him in 5 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the number because she had counted it once. In her worst year, at 3 in the morning, when sleep was impossible and her mind needed something precise to hold on to, the number stuck. She had never been able to unstick it. He was wearing a charcoal coat she had never seen before. He looked exactly like himself, exactly like the man she last saw across a conference table, signing documents without looking at her. He was looking at her now. He hadn't said anything, neither had she. Her first thought, word for word, "Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no." She didn't say that. She said, "Elliot." He said, "Grace." And then Sophie's voice came from behind her. "Mama, who is that?" Grace did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Elliot's face and watched him watch his daughter walk up behind her mother and press her face against Grace's hip. Sophie stared at the tall man in the driveway with open, completely unself-conscious curiosity. Sophie had never learned to hide what she was looking at. She had not inherited that particular skill from either parent. Owen appeared a second later, quieter, standing slightly behind his sister, watching. Something moved across Elliot's face. Grace saw it and immediately wished she hadn't. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for legal language and cold precision. She had prepared for the version of Elliot that arrived fully armored and professionally remote. She had not prepared for the expression she was looking at now. She said, quietly, "Sophie, take your brother back inside. Finish your drawings." Sophie said, "But who is—" "Inside, now." Sophie went, pulling Owen by the hand, already narrating the event in a low voice. The door didn't quite close behind them. Grace stepped out onto the porch and pulled it shut. The autumn air was cold. She crossed her arms because she was cold, not because she was afraid. She told herself that twice. "How did you find me?" she said. "Does it matter?" "Yes." He didn't answer that directly. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed an envelope. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it. She already knew what was inside. Something in her had known since the moment she opened the door. But she opened the envelope anyway, because not opening it would be an admission. The photograph was a candid, taken from a distance. She was at Sophie and Owen's 4th birthday party in her mother's backyard. She was kneeling between them, her arms around both, her face turned towards Sophie, who was mid-laugh. Owen was pressing his forehead against her cheek. They were all wearing paper crowns. The afternoon light in the photograph was the particular gold of late September. She remembered that afternoon exactly. Dorothy had made the cake. Renee had been in charge of the balloon situation, which had become complicated. It had been a perfect day. Grace looked at the photo for a long time. "When did you get this?" she said. "Tuesday." Today was Thursday. He had moved fast. Of course he had. Elliot Prescott had built an empire on the principle that speed was a form of power. Who sent it? Anonymous. She tucked the photo back into the envelope. She held the envelope at her side. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular, and she focused on keeping her face still. She had learned to do that during the divorce. During the months when his lawyers were systematically reducing her life to line items. "You should go," she said. "Grace, you can't just show up here, at my home, with my children inside." Her voice was controlled, but something was moving underneath it, tectonic and slow. "Whatever you want to say, whatever you're planning to do, it needs to go through my attorney." "You don't have an attorney." "I will by morning." He looked at her for a long time, in a way he had almost never looked at her when they were married. She couldn't read it. She didn't like that she couldn't read it. "Are they mine?" he said. It was the most inadequate question she had ever heard. She said, "Good night, Elliot," and went back inside. She closed the door. She locked it. She stood in her entry hall in the dark and listened to the sounds of her children in the kitchen. Sophie's narration continued uninterrupted. Owen's clay made a small, soft sound against the table. The ordinary sounds of a life she had built from the ground up. She breathed, in, out, in, then she sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway, her back against the door, her knees pulled up, her heart still doing that loud, irregular thing. 3 minutes. She allowed herself 3 minutes on the floor. Not because 3 minutes would fix anything, because she needed to feel the floor beneath her. Solid, specific, hers. She counted to 180. Then she stood up. She straightened her shirt. She went back into the kitchen to finish making dinner. The water was still boiling. At the table, Sophie looked up and said, "Who is that man, Mama?" Grace picked up the pasta. She lowered it into the water. She watched it slide in. "Nobody you know?" she said. "Eat your drawing and wash your hands." Sophie said, "You can't eat a drawing." Grace said, "Then just wash your hands." Owen said nothing, but he looked at the front door for a moment, the way he looked at things he was thinking about, the way he looked at something he intended to think about later, in his own time, on his own terms. Then he went back to his clay. Dinner was pasta with tomatoes from the garden, and bread Grace had made the day before, because bread was one of those things that helped when she didn't know what else to do. Sophie ate enthusiastically and spoke between every bite. Owen ate carefully and said 4 sentences, all of them precise. Grace sat between them and listened and made the appropriate responses and managed to eat most of her own meal. Bath time, Story time. The negotiation about which nightlight, the glass of water, the final good night. Grace sat on the edge of her bed and called Renee. Renee answered on the second ring. Grace said, "He came to the house." Silence on Renee's end. A specific kind of silence. The kind that meant Renee was processing something she had been half expecting and half dreading. Then, "Oh, Grace. Tonight, he was standing in the driveway. Are you okay?" Grace looked at her hands. "I don't know." "Are the kids okay?" "They don't know anything. Sophie asked who he was. I told her nobody." More silence. "Renee, he's going to come back." "I know." "He's going to bring lawyers." "I know." "What do I do?" Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing Grace had needed someone to say for 5 years. She said it quietly and without drama, and it landed exactly where it needed to land. "You already survived the hardest part," Renee said. "All of it. You did that alone. Whatever comes next, you don't have to do alone." Grace didn't answer for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree in the front yard. She could hear it from here. That tree had been one of the reasons she chose this house. She had stood in the front yard on the day she came to look at it and heard that tree move, and something in her chest had said, "Here." "I need Marcus," she said. "I'll text him right now." She hung up. She sat in the dark. She picked up her phone. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock. She put it down. She did not sleep until 2 in the morning. Grace woke at 5:45, not because her alarm went off, because she had never gone fully to sleep. She had moved through the night in shallow water, surfacing every hour, checking the window, settling back down, surfacing again. She had not slept like this since the first year after the divorce. She had forgotten how exhausting it was to be afraid in the dark. She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the street while it brewed. His car was not there. She hadn't expected it to be. Elliot Prescott did not sit in parked cars outside people's houses in the early morning. He sent people. He made calls. He built positions before he walked into rooms. The coffee finished. She poured a cup. The mug was ceramic, hand-thrown, something she had bought at a market in Asheville the first autumn she lived here. It was her favorite thing to hold in the morning, warm and slightly uneven in the hand, real. She called Marcus Webb at 7:15. He answered without surprise. Renee had reached him at 11 the night before, and he had spent the early morning preparing. His voice was steady and professionally warm. He took down everything she told him in the order she told it. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly to anything she said. When she finished, he asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them practical. Then he said, "Don't speak to Elliot or anyone representing him until we meet." "When can we meet?" "This morning, 9 o'clock, my office. I'll be there." She dropped the twins at her mother's house at 8. Dorothy Harmon met her at the door. She was wearing her housecoat, and she was already holding 2 cups of coffee, which meant she had been up longer than Grace. Her face carried the particular expression of a woman who had seen this coming and prayed it wouldn't. Not surprise. Something harder than surprise. The look of someone who has been bracing for a specific impact for a long time. "Come in," Dorothy said. "I can't stay," Grace said. "I have to meet Marcus." 5 minutes. Grace went in. They sat at Dorothy's kitchen table. The house smelled like toast and hand lotion and the lavender sachets her mother tucked into every drawer. It was the smell of every significant moment of Grace's childhood. Every bad day, every good day, every day that needed to be survived. This smell was home. Grace felt the tightness in her chest ease fractionally. "How did he find you?" Dorothy said. "Someone sent a photo. Anonymous. Dorothy's hands tightened around her cup. Who? I don't know. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the maple in the backyard. It had turned completely red overnight, it seemed like. The kind of thing you miss happening, and then there it is, suddenly complete. What are you going to do? Dorothy said. Let Marcus handle it. And the children? Grace looked at her mother. They're not going anywhere, Mom. He has resources we don't have. I know. Goodbye, honey. Dorothy set down her cup. She put her hand on the table between them, not quite reaching for Grace's hand. Just there. Available? I know you did what you did for the right reasons. I know that. But you've been carrying this for 5 years. Now it's not just yours to carry anymore. Grace wrapped both hands around her mug. The heat went through her palms, grounding. I know, she said. Her voice was quiet, certain in a way she had not expected. I've been waiting for this, in a way. I think part of me has been waiting since the beginning. Dorothy reached across and put her hand on Grace's. She didn't say anything. Sometimes Dorothy was wisest when she said nothing. Grace left. The meeting with Marcus took 3 hours. He was thorough and calm. When he explained Elliot's likely legal position, he did it without drama and without trying to frighten her. He laid out the facts as facts. Elliot had grounds to pursue paternity testing and parental rights. The question of whether Grace's decision to withhold the pregnancy constituted actionable harm was more complicated. That was where the texture of the situation lived. Grace listened. She asked questions. Practical ones. Precise ones. She had brought a notebook. She filled 2 pages. At the end, Marcus said, "You're going to be all right, Grace. This is manageable." "I know," she said. She did not entirely know. She drove home, parked in her driveway, sat in the car for a while. The inside of the car was warm from the October sun. The dashboard clock read 12:47. She had 7 missed calls. 3 were from numbers she didn't recognize, which meant Elliot's people had already been working. One was from Charlotte Prescott. She stared at Charlotte's name for a long moment. Charlotte Prescott, Elliot's younger sister, 35 years old. They had been, in the marriage, something close to friends. Not the deep friendship that is built over years of chosen intimacy, but the warm, careful friendship that can develop between women who are linked by circumstance and find they genuinely like each other anyway. Grace had not spoken to Charlotte in 5 years. She put the phone in her bag and went inside. The confrontation she had expected came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Not Elliot himself. His attorney, a man named Richard Holt, arrived at her door with a document pouch and the particular energy of someone who does this kind of thing before lunch on a regular basis. He was polite. Professionally polite in the way that is a kind of aggression, the way that says I am being courteous because courtesy is efficient. He handed her a packet. He explained, briefly, what it contained. A formal request for a paternity confirmation. A notice of Elliot Prescott's intent to establish parental rights. A preliminary hearing date, filed in family court for the following month. Grace took the packet. She thanked him. She closed the door. She set the packet on her kitchen counter. She did not open it. She picked up her phone and called Marcus and read him the name of the filing attorney. "He's moving fast," she said. "He is," Marcus replied. "That tells us something." "What does it tell us?" "That he wants the children, not only to punish you." A pause, or not exclusively for that reason. Grace was quiet. "What do you want, Grace, Barsama, Babisambada biting?" Marcus asked. "Not what you're afraid of. What do you actually want?" Nobody had asked her that in a very long time. She stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard. At the playset, she and Renee had assembled themselves over one long spring weekend, arguing cheerfully about instructions written in 4 languages. At the garden, she had started the year she moved in and slowly expanded, season by season, because the children liked to dig and she liked to watch things grow. I want them to be okay, she said. Both of them. I want them to never feel like a secret or a mistake. I want them to have a childhood they look back on and feel safe inside of. And Elliot? Marcus said. She didn't answer for a moment. The oak tree moved. A single leaf came down, spinning slowly. I want him to understand why, she finally said. Not as an excuse, just, I want him to understand. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Let's figure out how to get you there. That evening, Grace sat at the kitchen table after dinner while Sophie and Owen were in the bath. She opened the filing packet. She read every page, slowly, twice. She thought it would feel like a threat. It did, a little. But underneath the legal language, there was something else she couldn't quite name. A weight, but not only a bad kind of weight. Like something that had been suspended in the air for 5 years was finally landing. She picked up her pen. She began to write notes in the margins. She was not afraid. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated and more useful than either. She was a mother, and she was a woman, and she had been surviving since long before this document arrived on her counter. She would keep surviving after it. She made herself a cup of tea. She went back to the papers. The clock ticked. The house breathed around her. This was where the story truly began. The flashbacks didn't announce themselves. They arrived like weather, a certain quality of light through the kitchen window, a smell carried in from outside, a word used in a specific way, and suddenly Grace was somewhere else. Not here in the life she had built. Back there, inside the marriage, inside the years she had spent becoming slowly invisible, inside a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like success. She had met Elliot at 26. She was designing residential spaces for a small firm in Charlotte. He was acquiring property all over the region. He came into her office on a Tuesday for a meeting about a penthouse renovation, and he was so direct, so completely focused on her, that she had mistaken it for something it wasn't. She had mistaken precision for presence. She had made that mistake for a long time. The early years were good. She would not pretend otherwise. The story didn't let her. They were genuinely, fully good. He was attentive, in his way, driven and intense and interested in her mind. He bought her books and remembered her opinions, and when he was in the room, he was fully in the room. The problem was, he was rarely in the room. The company expanded. Chicago, then Dallas, then London. He was gone for weeks at a time, and when he was home, he was simultaneously home and elsewhere. His phone in his hand at dinner. His attention divided, his body present, and his mind in a meeting 12 time zones away. She tried to talk about it. Once, twice, many times in many different ways. She tried the direct approach and the gentle approach and the approach she had read about in a book that Renee had given her, which involved specific language and non-accusatory framing. He listened. He apologized. He made changes that lasted 3 weeks. She took on her own clients, built her design practice into something she was proud of. He said he was proud of her. He said it the way you say you're proud of something that doesn't require your attention. The way you approve of something without engaging with it. She stopped mentioning her work eventually, not because he told her to, because it was easier. Because she was tired of watching him look at his phone while she spoke. Because small compressions are easier to make than to fight, one day at a time, until one day you have compressed yourself down to something you barely recognize. There was a specific memory that came back now, 5 years later, as she sat at her kitchen table with the legal documents and the cold tea. A dinner party. 3 years into the marriage, she was talking to a woman across the table. a writer named Margaret, interesting and funny and direct in the way Grace had once been direct. And she realized mid-sentence that she had introduced herself as Elliot's wife 3 times. She had given no other information about herself. Margaret was being kind and politely curious and asking her what she did, and Grace had hesitated before answering, as if she wasn't sure anymore. That was the moment. Not the last straw, not the beginning of the end, but the first real look in the mirror. The kind where you see something that stops you, even if you're not ready yet to do anything about what you see. She didn't leave then. She stayed for 2 more years. She tried marriage counseling. He attended 4 sessions before a London trip made it impossible, and then somehow he never rescheduled. She tried a different approach, being more accommodating, more strategic, making herself smaller and easier and more compliant, fitting herself into the shape of the space he had left for her. It made things worse. Being accommodating made her disappear faster. The night she made her decision was a Thursday in April. She had just returned from a 3-week consulting project in Savannah, the best 3 weeks she'd had in years. She was working, fully herself, her opinions valued, her ideas implemented. She came home to their penthouse in Charlotte with her suitcase and a bottle of good wine and a feeling like maybe she could bring this version of herself back here. Maybe there was still a version of this marriage in which both of them were real. Elliot was on the phone when she walked in. He held up one finger. 20 minutes later, he was still on the call. When he finally hung up, he said, "Sorry, how was it?" She told him it was excellent. She told him 3 specific things that had happened. The client who had cried when she saw the finished living room, the discovery of a beautiful old hardware store on a back street where she had found exactly the right drawer pulls, the colleague who had told her she was the best collaborator he had ever worked with. Elliot said, "Great. Look, I need to tell you about Dubai." She looked at him, really looked. The way she had stopped letting herself look, because looking clearly at something means you have to decide what to do about what you see. And she understood. Completely. Quietly. Without drama. Nothing was going to change. Not because he was a bad person, but because their marriage, her needs, her presence in the room, was simply not in his hierarchy. It had never been in his hierarchy. She had been waiting all this time for him to rearrange something that was never going to rearrange. She filed 6 weeks later. The divorce itself was clinical. His lawyers arrived fully prepared, which meant he had been prepared before she filed. He saw it coming and built a position rather than trying to prevent it. That told her everything she needed to know about where she stood in the calculation. She signed the papers in November, walked out into cold air, called Renee, said, "It's done." Renee said, "Come over." She did. 11 days later, she sat on Renee's bathroom floor and watched a pregnancy test resolve. 2 lines. She sat there for a very long time. The bathroom was small and warm and smelled like Renee's particular soap, something eucalyptus-based she had used for years. The tile was cold under Grace. The test was on the edge of the sink. Her first thought, honest and complicated, and completely her own. Oh, not panic. Not yet. Just, just the enormous, silent weight of a single syllable. Renee knocked on the door after a while. Grace said, "Come in." Renee came in, saw the test on the edge of the sink. She sat down on the floor next to Grace without saying anything. They sat there for probably 15 minutes. Nobody said anything. Sometimes nothing is the right thing to say. Sometimes sitting on the tile floor together does the entire help. Eventually, Renee said, "What do you need?" Grace said, "I need to think." She thought for 2 weeks. She thought through every scenario with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that this was not a small decision. She thought about calling Elliot. She thought about it seriously. She drafted the conversation in her head 100 different ways. Some of them ended reasonably. Some of them ended in ways she didn't want to think about for long. And then one evening, she was on the phone with Renee, and she heard herself say, "He told his mother he was relieved." Renee went very quiet. "When did he say that?" "At the attorney's office, during the asset division. I was in the hallway and his mother was with him, and I could hear them through the door. He said exactly that, relieved. No children to complicate things." A long silence. "Grace," Renee said, "that man doesn't get to use your children as complications in his schedule." She had thought that herself, but hearing it out loud from someone else made it land differently, made it real in a way that internal thought could not quite accomplish. She thinks about it now, 5 years later. She thinks about whether she was right. She doesn't always know the answer with certainty. Some nights, the uncertainty is louder than others. But she knows this: she was not wrong to want her children to be wanted. She was not wrong to want to raise them somewhere outside of a hierarchy that had no room for them. God, I was so stupid. No, I wasn't stupid. I was afraid. And afraid is different. She picked up her pen. She returned to the margins of the document. She was here. She had survived. Whatever came next, she was not the woman who had hesitated at a dinner party, not sure what to call herself. She knew exactly what to call herself now. There was a photograph Grace had packed when she left Charlotte. Not many photographs made it into the boxes. Most of the ones from the marriage stayed in the penthouse, stayed in digital files she no longer accessed, stayed in the particular purgatory of things that were once important and are now too complicated to either keep or throw away. But this one photograph she had taken with her. It was from the first year of the marriage, a Saturday in July. They had driven out to the mountains with no particular plan and found a trail and walked it for 3 hours, and at the top, there was a view that felt like the whole world spread out below them. Elliot had been fully present that day. His phone was in his pocket. His eyes were on her. He laughed at something she said, and the laugh was real, and she had thought, standing there, that this is who he is. This is who we are. She had asked a passing hiker to take the photograph. She and Elliot were standing close, her head against his shoulder, both of them looking at the camera, with the particular ease of people who are exactly where they want to be. She had kept the photograph because it was true. That day was true. She had not wanted to make the entire marriage false in her memory just because it ended badly. She knew women who did that, who rewrote the beginning to match the ending. She understood it, but she couldn't do it herself. The marriage had been true, and the marriage had also been insufficient. Both things were true at once. She had spent a long time trying to decide which truth was more important. She had eventually understood that was the wrong question. The right question was, what do I build now? She had built this house, this work, these children. Owen's voice came from down the hall, requesting a specific stuffed animal that had apparently migrated to an unknown location. Grace went to find it, found it behind the couch, as things always ended up behind the couch, brought it back. Owen received it with the gravity of someone accepting a very important diplomatic document. She stood in his doorway for a moment after he settled back under his blanket. He looked up at her. "Is everything okay, Mama? Everything is okay?" she said. He considered this. "You seem like you're thinking about something." "I am," she said. "But it's okay thinking, not bad thinking." He considered this as well. Then he tucked his stuffed animal under his arm and closed his eyes with the decisive finality of someone who has received adequate information. She went back to the kitchen. She thought about the conference room meeting that was coming. She thought about what she needed to say. She thought about how to say it in a way that was true without being a weapon. She thought about the night before she filed for divorce. She had sat in the living room of the penthouse at midnight while Elliot was in London, and she had made a list. Not a pros and cons list, not a this is what's wrong list. Just a list of the things she wanted. Simple things. To be asked about her day and have the person asking actually wait for the answer. To have her opinions remembered. To feel, in her own home, like the most important person in the room to at least one other person. That was the whole list. It had not seemed like too much to ask. She had not been able to get it there. She understood now, 5 years later, and with more clarity than she had at the time, that it was not only Elliot's failing. She had also been afraid of asking for it directly. She had circled it and approached it sideways and dropped hints like seeds, hoping something would grow. She had not stood in the middle of the room and said, "This is what I need from you." She thought about that a lot. She thought about what she would do differently, not in the sense of staying or leaving. She had made the right decision about that, but differently in the sense of her own voice, in the sense of asking directly for what she needed, rather than hoping it would be noticed. She had gotten better at asking. In her work, with her clients, with Dorothy and Renee, even with Marcus. With Elliot, she had never learned to ask because she had been afraid of the answer. And the answer, when it came, had come sideways, through a closed door, in a sentence not intended for her. Relieved. The word still had a specific weight. It always would. But she noticed, sitting at her kitchen table in October, that the weight had changed over 5 years. It had gone from a wound to a scar, something present and permanent that no longer bled when she touched it. She thought, I am ready for this meeting. I am actually ready. Not because she felt strong in the way of someone who hasn't been hurt, but because she felt strong in the way of someone who has been hurt and rebuilt and knows the specific difference between before and after. She made a second cup of tea. She wrote more notes in the margins. Outside, the oak tree moved in the October wind. The leaves were coming down. By next week, the branches would be bare. There was something Grace had always loved about bare branches. The way they showed the structure underneath. The way you could finally see the shape of the whole tree once the leaves were gone. The essential architecture, everything decorative, stripped away. She could see the shape of things now. Finally, after all this time, she picked up her pen and wrote, in the margin of a legal document, "What I want for my children is a life that knows its own shape." She looked at that for a moment, then she circled it. The second meeting with Elliot happened on a Friday, not at her house, at Marcus's office, on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The kind of office where the air conditioning ran too cold and the lighting made everyone look slightly unwell, and the silence between people cost money per hour. Elliot came with Richard Holt and one other attorney, whose name Grace immediately stopped tracking because she was focused entirely on keeping her face still. Renee had offered to come. Grace had said no. This needed to be clean. Elliot looked different in this context, more like the man she had divorced, contained, formal, operating on procedure. He looked at her once when he sat down. She looked back. Neither of them was rude. Neither of them was warm. Marcus opened with Grace's position, clear and structured. Grace did not dispute Elliot's right to know about his biological children. She did not dispute his right to pursue a paternal relationship within appropriate limits and parameters. She did dispute the timeline and the pace of Holt's filing, which she described as aggressive and unnecessarily destabilizing to 2 5-year-old children who had known nothing but stability. Holt began to respond. Elliot put his hand on the table, a flat palm, quiet and final. Holt stopped. Elliot said, "Why didn't you tell me?" The real question, sitting in the middle of the room in all its impossible weight, Grace looked at him, not through him, at him. You said you were relieved, she said. At the asset division, you told your mother you were relieved there were no children to complicate things. The room went very quiet. Elliot's expression shifted. Not guilt, not exactly, something adjacent to it, something that looked like recognition. I didn't know you heard that, he said. I know you didn't. Another silence. Holt started to say something about this not being the appropriate context for a personal discussion. Marcus cut him off gently. He said that circumstances were germane to the question of what happened next, and that made them entirely appropriate context. Elliot said, that was a careless thing to say. Grace said, it was an honest thing to say. He didn't respond to that. She continued, measured. She had prepared this not as a performance, but as preparation. She had wanted to be clear rather than emotional, not because emotion was wrong, but because clarity was what served her children. I was 11 days post-divorce, she said. I was in the most vulnerable position of my adult life. Your legal team had spent 6 months systematically taking inventory of everything in our marriage and assigning it a dollar value. I had just heard you tell your mother you were relieved, and I was pregnant. She paused. I made a decision to protect my children from being items in someone's schedule. I am not saying it was the right decision. I'm saying it was the only one I could see from where I was standing. Elliot looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. I have a right to know my children, he said. Yes, Grace said, you do. Then why? I just told you why. The anger surfaced now, hers, rising through the controlled surface like something that had been building pressure for a very long time. You had 6 years of a marriage where I was functionally invisible, she said. You were never cruel. I want you to know I have never thought you were cruel. But I was disappearing in that marriage, Elliot, slowly, quietly, and you didn't notice, not once, not until I filed. And when I filed, you went straight to the attorneys. That told me everything I needed to know about where I was and your priorities. She stopped. Then, I was pregnant, and I chose to raise my children somewhere they would never have to wonder if they mattered. The room was very still. Holt was looking at the table. The other attorney was looking at the window. Marcus was watching Grace with quiet attention. Elliot said, That's not fair. No, she said, probably not. None of this is entirely fair. The meeting dissolved into logistics after that. Timeline for the paternity test, which Grace agreed to immediately. She wanted it on record. She had nothing to hide. She had never had anything to hide on this particular question. In the elevator lobby, Elliot broke from his attorneys. He said her name. She turned. He looked different. The corporate version had cracked at the edges, just slightly. Like a wall that has developed a hairline fracture. You would not see it unless you were looking for it. Grace was looking for it. Are they okay? He said. She looked at him. She thought about Sophie at the dinner table, narrating her drawing with documentary seriousness. Owen, pressing a bottle cap into clay with focused precision. Yes, she said. They're wonderful. Something moved across his face. Grief, maybe. Loss. The specific ache of 5 years you cannot recover and cannot stop wishing you could. She got in the elevator. On the drive home, she stopped at a red light. She gripped the steering wheel. She said out loud, to nobody, into the empty car, the thing she needed to hear in her own voice. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know exactly who I was and what I needed, and I am not sorry for surviving. The light changed. She drove. That evening, she picked up the twins from Dorothy's. Owen ran to her and wrapped both arms around her legs, and she picked him up. She could barely do it anymore. He was getting so tall. She held him with her face against the top of his head and breathed in the smell of his hair. Soap and outside and something uniquely, entirely Owen that she had been breathing in since the first moment she held him, and that had never once failed to return her to herself. This is why. Sophie was at the kitchen table with Grandma's colored pencils. She looked up and said, "Grandma says you were at a meeting. Was it boring? Meetings look boring on television." Grace laughed, real and sudden and unmanaged. "So boring," she said. "Incredibly boring." Sophie nodded with great satisfaction and returned to her drawing. Dorothy caught Grace's eye across the kitchen. They held the look for a moment. Grace gave a small nod. Dorothy released a breath that she had probably been holding for most of the day. They ate dinner together, all four of them, loud and ordinary and exactly what Grace needed. Charlotte Prescott called on a Saturday morning. Grace was in the garden pulling up the last of the fall tomatoes. The twins were running through the yard behind her. Sophie was shrieking at a leaf pile with the full commitment of someone who has found their purpose. Owen was watching a beetle with profound scientific seriousness. Grace's phone rang from her jacket pocket. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she saw the name and stood up from the garden bed and brushed dirt from her gloves. She answered, "Charlotte." A pause, then, "Grace, I'm sorry. I know this is..." A breath. "I know." Grace didn't say anything yet. "It was me," Charlotte said. "I sent it. I need you to know it was me." The garden was quiet except for Sophie and Owen behind her. Grace turned slightly, angled herself away, kept her voice low. "Why?" she said. "Because..." Charlotte's voice shifted. Something in it broke gently, like ice on a late winter pond. Not dramatically, but with that quiet giving way. "Because he's been empty, Grace. For years. Since the divorce, he's just been. Bigger, richer, more successful, and completely, entirely empty. And I was looking at my friend Claire's Instagram, and she had reposted something from your public page, the birthday party. And I saw those faces, and I just..." A pause. "I knew immediately. I knew from Owen's hands. Owen's hands. Long-fingered and careful. They were unmistakably Prescott hands. Grace had known it from the first time she looked at them in the hospital. She had loved those hands with a ferocity that surprised her, those particular hands on her particular child. Grace sat down on the garden bench. The cold of the wood went through her jeans. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," Charlotte said. "I want you to know that. I thought if he knew, he would have to confront something. I thought it might be good for him. I did not think about how it might land for you, and I am genuinely sorry for that. He showed up at my house, Charlotte, 2 days after he got it, with no warning. I know, and I'm so sorry. I underestimated how fast he would move. I thought he would take time to think about it. He doesn't take time to think about things." "No," Grace said. "He doesn't." A silence between them, not an uncomfortable one, more like two people standing in the same weather, acknowledging it without drama. Charlotte said, very quietly, "Are they beautiful?" Grace looked over her shoulder. Sophie had fallen sideways into the leaf pile, arms wide, laughing the full-body laugh she had been doing since she was 8 months old. Owen was now crouching very close to the ground, watching something only he could see. "Yes," Grace said. "They are." Charlotte made a sound that was almost a sob and wasn't quite. She recovered. "I'm not calling to take his side. I want you to know that. I'm calling because I want you to know what you're actually dealing with. Not the lawyer version. The actual Elliot." A pause. "He came home from your meeting, and he didn't sleep. My mother called me because she thought something was wrong with him. He sat in his study for 3 hours. He didn't take any calls. For Elliot Prescott, that is the equivalent of a complete collapse. Grace was quiet. He's not the same man, Charlotte said. He's still Elliot. He's still going to be infuriating in all the ways he's always been infuriating, but he is not the same man who made you invisible. How do you know I felt invisible? Grace said. Because I watched it happen, Charlotte replied, simple and direct. I watched it happen for years, and I didn't say anything. And that is something I carry. I should have said something. The autumn sun was warm on Grace's face. The smell of turned earth and dying tomato plants was around her. The sounds of Sophie and Owen behind her. What do you want from me, Charlotte? She said. Nothing, genuinely. I just wanted you to know who sent it. And I wanted to say, whatever you decide about the children, about access, about all of it, you deserve to decide it from a position of strength, not fear. You don't have to be afraid of him. I'm not afraid of him, Grace said. A pause. Then Charlotte said, Good. They talked for another 20 minutes. It was strange and a little disorienting, talking to someone who was both inside the family Grace had escaped and genuinely, warmly in her corner. But Charlotte had always been that. Grace had almost forgotten. Before they hung up, Charlotte said, He doesn't know it was me. Why didn't you put your name on it? Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted him to sit with not knowing. I wanted him to think about who in his life knew about this and decided he needed to find out. I wanted him to think about what kind of person he had become, that this was how he found out. Grace considered this. That's either very wise or very mean. Probably both, Charlotte said. Grace almost laughed. She did not laugh, but almost. After she hung up, she sat in the garden for a while. The sun moved. Sophie brought her an impressive leaf. Owen placed a smooth stone in her palm, without explanation. A gift, the way he gave things, without announcement or ceremony, just a transfer of something he had decided she should have. She closed her fingers around the stone. She thought about Charlotte's words. You deserve to decide from a position of strength, not fear. She had been moving through this week in controlled panic, functioning, maintaining the surface, doing all the right things. But underneath it, fear had been the driver. Fear of his resources, fear of courts and motions and the machinery of wealth turned in her direction. When did I start letting fear drive? When did I stop trusting myself? Not questions, statements, recognitions. I stopped trusting myself somewhere in that marriage, and I have been slowly, carefully getting it back ever since. I am not going to let this pull me backwards. She stood up. She put the stone in her jacket pocket. Sophie, she called. Owen, inside, lunch. Sophie launched herself out of the leaf pile. Owen picked up his stick. Apparently he had been using it to redirect the beetle's path, which was between him and the beetle, and followed. Grace went inside her house, the one she had chosen and paid for and filled with the particular, specific texture of her own life. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. Charlotte Prescott sent the letter, she said. Elliot's sister. She's not hostile. She won't testify for either side. But she is not his ally in this. That's useful, Marcus said. I want to propose a framework, Grace said. For the children. Something I design. Not his attorney's template. Not the court's default. Something that accounts for who my children actually are. Marcus said, Tell me what you're thinking. She did. For 45 minutes she sat at her kitchen table and laid it out. And for the first time since Thursday evening she felt completely like herself. Wednesday night. The twins were asleep. The house was quiet, with the particular quality of a house at 9:30 when you are the only adult in it. Grace was at her drafting table in the studio, the room at the back of the house she had converted from a sunroom with its north-facing light and its corkboard covered in samples and the particular smell of paper and pencil and the faint cedar of the drawer where she kept her favorite tools. Normally, this was her favorite room in the world. Tonight it felt smaller than usual. Her phone had 19 unread emails. 3 from Holt's office, 2 from a journalist whose name she didn't recognize, who had somehow found her contact information, who was asking whether she would like to comment on what the email referred to as a private family matter involving the Prescott estate and 2 minor children. Grace read this email twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. So it's going to be like that, she called Renee. Vivian, she said when Renee answered. Oh, Grace, no. A journalist, asking me to comment on the private family matter involving the Prescott estate and 2 minor children. She read directly from the email. Her voice was controlled and furious, which was a combination she had learned during the divorce and had hoped never to need again. She made a call. She decided that Prescott grandchildren were news, Renee said, very quietly, that woman. Me. My children are 5 years old. They are 5. And she is going to turn them into a headline. Can Marcus do something? He's working on it. I called him the moment I read it. What do you need right now? Grace looked around her studio, at the corkboard, at the pale green tile samples for the Henderson kitchen renovation, brass hardware, warm wood, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly beautiful project. Hers. I don't know, she said. Then the control slipped a little. Just enough. Renee, I'm so tired. I have been carrying this for 5 years. Completely alone, in the middle of the night, for 5 years. And now everyone is moving so fast, and there are lawyers and journalists, and I am trying to stay ahead of it, and I can't. I cannot stay ahead of it. Renee was quiet. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say, the quiet of someone who is giving what they're hearing the space it deserves. Then she said, You don't have to stay ahead of it, Grace. You just have to stay. Grace closed her eyes. You built a life, Renee continued. A real one, not a survival mode life, a genuine, beautiful, real life. With those 2 kids, and your work and your garden and your terrible rosemary that you keep insisting is going to come back. Grace made a sound that was almost a laugh. And nobody can take that. He can ask for visitation. He can file motions and spend money and hire a second team of attorneys if he wants to. But Sophie and Owen wake up in their beds in your house, with the purple nightlight and the stone collection and the drawing on the refrigerator. That is still true tomorrow. That is still true, regardless of whatever happens. Grace opened her eyes. The studio was still small, but the walls had stopped pressing. Come over, Renee said. It's almost 10. I have the wine and those crackers you like. Come over. Grace almost said no. Then she looked at the 19 unread emails and said, 20 minutes. She called Dorothy. Dorothy said she had a bag packed for exactly this kind of evening, which made Grace's throat go tight in a way that didn't have a clean name. She drove to Renee's. They sat on Renee's back porch under the string lights, the crackers, the wine, the particular comfort of a friendship old enough to not require performance. Grace finally let herself not be okay, for a specific amount of time, in the specific safety of this specific porch. She cried once, briefly, more from exhaustion than from grief. Renee didn't say anything during it, just sat there. The string lights made small, soft sounds in the wind. After, Grace drank her wine and said, He's not who I remember. Renee waited. At the meeting, He shut his attorney up just to ask me a real question. He looked at me like I was a person. She paused. Not an item. Renee said, Does that change anything? I don't know. Not in the way I'm scared it does. What does that mean? It means we are not going back. That is not a possibility I am entertaining. But Grace looked at the lights. He's their father. He is actually their father, and I spent 5 years making sure that didn't matter, and now I keep thinking about Owen. You know how he watches things. He watched that man in the driveway for a long time before Sophie pulled him inside. What are you going to do? Grace took a sip of wine, set down the glass. I'm going to call him directly. Marcus says not to. But Marcus is thinking about legal exposure, and I'm thinking about my children, and those are not the same calculation. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been biting my tongue about Elliot Prescott for 6 years. But I will say this one time. If there is any version of him that actually means what he says, if there is any version in which those children can have a father who shows up, then you are the person who can build that version, because you built everything else. Grace looked at her friend. Renee was looking back with the clear, steady expression of someone who has known you long enough to tell the complete truth. I hate that you're right, Grace said. I'm usually right. You always hate it. They stayed until midnight. Grace drove home through quiet streets, windows down, the night air cold and clean. She parked, sat in the car for a moment. The light was on in the guest room window. Dorothy, reading in the chair. She went inside, checked on Sophie. Asleep face down, one arm hanging off the bed, in a position that looked deeply uncomfortable and apparently wasn't. Checked on Owen. Asleep on his back, one hand open beside his face. The smooth stone from the garden was on his nightstand. He had kept it. She stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching him breathe. Starting over had felt impossible, but staying in the version of things that had been was no longer an option. Both of those things were true. Between them was a narrow, specific path, and she was going to walk it. She went to bed. Tomorrow she would call Elliot. She called him at 9 in the morning on Thursday. Marcus had not been informed. She would deal with that afterward. He answered on the second ring. Grace, I need to talk to you, she said. Not through attorneys, not through your mother, just you and me, somewhere, without an audience. A pause. Okay. Saturday. There's a coffee place called Harlow's on Merrifield Street. 11 o'clock. Another pause. She could not tell if he was calculating or simply adjusting. I'll be there, he said. She hung up before she started second-guessing it. Saturday came with cold sun, the kind of clarity that autumn delivers after a week of overcast. She told Dorothy she had an errand. She drove to Harlow's 20 minutes early, chose a corner table, ordered a coffee she probably wouldn't finish, and sat with her hands around the mug. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like roasting and cinnamon and the particular low hum of a Saturday morning place. Laptops and newspapers, and 2 women at a table near the window having a conversation Grace could not hear, but whose tone she recognized. The tone of working something out. He arrived exactly at 11. He saw her and crossed the room without looking at anything else in it. He sat down, ordered a black coffee. They sat in silence for a moment. Thank you for doing this, he said. I'm doing this for Sophie and Owen, she said. That needs to be clear from the beginning. He nodded. No qualification. No, of course. Just a nod. She had prepared. She had notes organized in her head. But sitting across from him in a normal coffee shop on a normal Saturday morning, she found that what she had prepared and what she actually wanted to say were slightly different things. Tell me what you want, she said. Not your attorneys. You. He looked at his coffee, then at her. I want to know them, he said. I want to be in their lives. consistently, not as a concept or a presence on holidays. I know I'm starting from nothing. I know they don't know me. I know this will take time. He paused. I've been angry, Grace, about the 5 years. I want to be honest about that. I know. And I've also been... He stopped, looked at the table. This was clearly more difficult for him. I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting about the marriage. He looked up. I know I made you invisible. I didn't know I was doing it. I understand that is not an excuse. Grace waited. I've been in therapy, he said, for about 18 months. I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you in this context. It might mean something, she said carefully. I'm not telling you to change anything about how you think of me. I'm telling you because I want to be honest, maybe for the first time in a significant way. He looked at her steadily. I was not present in our marriage. I chose the company over and over, and I called it responsibility. And it was actually avoidance. I was afraid of closeness, and I structured my entire life to never have to be present for it. By the time I understood that, it was already gone. The coffee shop hummed around them. A barista called a name. Someone's laptop made a notification sound. Grace said, Why are you telling me this? Because I want to be present for my children, and I think you need to know I understand why I wasn't present for you. Those things are connected. She looked at him for a long moment. He never loved me. He loved the idea of me. The thought came, the familiar one, the one she had turned over 100 times, but something was different about it now. It was present, without wounding. It was simply true, a settled thing, no longer a live injury. I'm going to tell you something, she said. I need you to listen without responding until I'm done. He nodded. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified, not of being a mother. I was terrified of what you would do. Not because you were dangerous, because you were powerful, and I was 11 days post-divorce, and I had just spent 6 months watching your lawyers reduce my life to line items. And I had heard you tell your mother you were relieved. She paused, held the pause, let it be as heavy as it was. I decided my children would never be something you were relieved about. I decided they would be wanted, fully, unconditionally, without qualification. Since I couldn't guarantee that from you, I decided to guarantee it from myself. He was listening, fully. His phone was in his pocket. His coffee was in front of him, untouched. I'm not saying it was the right decision, she continued. I've thought about that for 5 years, and I will probably think about it for the rest of my life. I know I denied you something real, and I know that mattered. I also know I protected my children and myself when I was not capable of anything larger than that. She met his eyes. I'm sorry for the parts that were about my own fear. I don't apologize for the parts that were about their well-being. A long silence. Then he said, I'm sorry, she waited, for the marriage, for making you invisible, for not being present, for going straight to the attorneys because it was easier than feeling anything. For what I said to my mother, which was a thoughtless, emotionally stunted thing to say, and I have thought about it constantly since Monday. He looked at the table. His jaw was tight. I have a son, and I can see from everything you've built that he is going to know exactly how to be present in a room because his mother taught him. And He stopped. I missed 5 years of that. Grace's throat was tight. She did not let it reach her face. She had learned to do that. She was glad now that she had learned it. Yes, she said. You did. I'd like to meet them, he said. When you decide it's right, on your terms, your pace, you set everything. She considered this. The question she had come here to answer. There are conditions, she said. Tell me. Your mother does not have unsupervised contact with my children. Not until she demonstrates. She understands this is my household and my parenting. She does not speak to journalists. She does not treat my children as Prescott assets. Agreed? Any arrangement is built around their school, their routine, their emotional well-being, not your travel schedule. Agreed. We do this slowly. You meet them as a family friend first, not as their father, not until I decide they're ready for that conversation, and we have a careful, specific plan for how to have it. He nodded. Agreed. She studied his face, looking for the thing that was always behind what he said. The calculation, the management, the angle. She didn't find one. Saturday, she said. Next Saturday. There's a park near my mother's house. It's casual. You're an old friend. Nothing more yet. He said, Thank you, Grace. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Because cold coffee was still coffee, and she had come here and done this hard thing and finished it, and she was still here and still herself. That was worth a cold cup. The morning of the park Saturday, Grace braided Sophie's hair while Sophie narrated the mythology of the specific leaf pile she intended to interact with and the precise characteristics required in a good stick for puddle navigation. Owen sat on the edge of the tub and watched this without comment. Grace tied off Sophie's braid. She looked at Owen in the mirror. You're quiet this morning, she said. Owen thought about this the way he thought about everything. Thoroughly. At his own pace. Is the man from the driveway going to be there? He said. Grace's hand stilled for a moment. Then she finished tying the ribbon. Yes, she said. He's an old friend of Mama's. Owen said, What's his name? Elliot? Owen turned this over, the way he turned everything over, looking for its weight and its edges. How do you know him? We used to know each other a long time ago, before you were born. Owen considered this carefully. Sophie, who had apparently been monitoring the conversation while pretending to be focused on her own reflection, said, Is he nice? I think he's trying to be, Grace said, which was the most honest answer she had. Sophie nodded, satisfied. Owen reached for his stone from the edge of the sink. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket since she had put it in his hand in the garden. He looked at it for a moment, then put it back. They drove to Harlow Park in the thin October sun. Dorothy was already on a bench with her coffee. Renee was there with her sunglasses, and the expression of someone attending an event under formal protest, but committed to behaving appropriately. Elliot's dark blue SUV was parked at the edge of the lot. He was standing beside it, jeans, a gray sweater. He looked, she registered with a complicated feeling she was not yet ready to name. Like a person rather than a presentation. Sophie saw him through the car window and said, Is that him? And was out of the car before Grace had fully parked. Grace caught her. Sophie, walk with me. Sophie took her hand but vibrated with contained energy. They crossed the parking lot. Dorothy and Renee fell in on either side of Grace. The geometry of it. Elliot watched them come. He was very still. He was taking them in, really taking them in, looking at Sophie's bright face and Owen's careful eyes, and the full fact of them, 5 years old and real and right in front of him. His expression was not controlled. He had no control over his expression at this moment, and Grace could see it, and she understood that this was real. Whatever happened next, this moment was real. Hi, Sophie said, directly to him. She had never been uncertain about speaking first. Elliot said, Hi. And his voice was different, softer than she had ever heard it. I'm Sophie, Sophie said. And this is Owen. He doesn't talk as much as me, but he's smarter. Owen, from behind Grace's leg, said with complete dignity, That is not correct. Elliot made a sound that was almost a laugh. His eyes went bright with something. I'm Elliot, he said. I've heard you're an expert on leaf piles. Sophie stared. Who told you that? A reliable source. Sophie looked at her mother with enormous eyes. He knows about the leaf piles. This was significant. She turned back to Elliot, with an entirely new level of assessment and said, "Okay, come and see if there are good ones by the water." She grabbed his hand, the way 5-year-olds do. Total confidence, no hesitation, no permission requested. Elliot looked down at her hand in his. Something moved across his face that Grace didn't want to look at too directly because it was too raw, and she wasn't ready for what it made her feel. He went with Sophie. Owen stayed near Grace. After a moment, he took her hand. They walked slightly behind, Owen watching ahead with his particular careful attention. Dorothy fell in beside Grace. She said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. Renee fell in on the other side. She was quiet for 45 seconds, which was a record. Then she said, very quietly, "He's good with her." Grace said, "I see that. That's not nothing, Grace. I know. I'm still watching him. I know you are. But I'm just saying, Renee, I know." They walked. 2 hours in the park. Sophie ran Elliot through every leaf pile with scientific rigor. Owen detached from Grace's hand eventually and moved parallel to Elliot. Not with him, but in proximity. A satellite orbit. Testing distance. That was how Owen approached everything he was uncertain about. Not avoidance, just gradual approach. At one point, Elliot crouched beside a puddle to look at something Owen had found. A stone or a reflection. Owen showed him without being asked. They were side by side, crouched over the water, and something about Owen's hands beside Elliot's hands made Grace's chest ache with a specific, quiet, particular kind of grief that was also not entirely grief. Dorothy said softly, "Grace?" "I see it," Grace said. "He has his grandfather's hands. Your father-in-law's hands." Grace breathed, "I know." At the end, when it was time to leave, Sophie said goodbye with a complete and immediate hug, and then ran to the car, already planning the next thing. Owen stopped in front of Elliot. He reached into his jacket pocket. He removed the smooth stone. He held it up. Elliot looked at it. Looked at Owen. "For me?" he said. Owen put it in his hand, then turned and walked to the car. Elliot stood looking at the stone in his palm for a moment that was about 10 seconds long and felt much longer. Then he looked at Grace. She said, "He doesn't give those to people he doesn't like." Elliot closed his fingers around the stone. He nodded. He didn't say anything, and she was glad for that, because anything he said would be insufficient, and he seemed to understand that. She got her children in the car. She drove. In the back seat, Sophie fell asleep in approximately 4 minutes. Owen was quiet, looking out the window at the passing street. After a while, he said, "He keeps it?" "I think so," Grace said. "Yes." Owen nodded. Returned to the window. Grace watched the road. Her hands were steady. Her heart was doing something quiet and complicated that she didn't have a word for yet. Something that might become a word eventually, when it finished becoming what it was. She was stronger than she had been a week ago. She was tired, and she was stronger, and she was building something she couldn't yet see the full shape of. But she could almost see it. And that was enough. 3 weeks later, Grace was sitting across from Elliot at her kitchen table. Not a conference room, not a coffee shop, with the formal geometry of a negotiation. Her kitchen table, at 6 in the evening, with Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator and the smell of the dinner that had happened an hour ago, still living in the warm air. The framework she had designed, drafted with Marcus over 2 weeks, revised 3 times, based entirely on what she actually knew about her actual children, was in front of them. Elliot read it carefully. All of it. She had expected him to skim. He didn't skim. Then he looked up. The gradual disclosure plan. You have it happening over 3 months. Yes. Why 3 months? Because Owen processes slowly and deeply. If we rush it, he will know we're rushing and he will not forgive either of us. She paused. Because Sophie will have 100 questions and every single one deserves a real answer. 3 months is a minimum. It might take longer. He considered this. Okay. They went through it, point by point. She spoke plainly. He asked clarifying questions. When he pushed back on the frequency of visits in the first 6 months, she explained her reasoning, and he accepted it. He was different in this room than he had been in the conference room. She could feel it. Not performing, just there. When they reached the section on Vivian, he didn't flinch. My mother will not have unsupervised contact, he said. I've already told her. How did she take it? He looked at the table. She took it the way she takes everything, like she's tolerating a temporary inconvenience. A small, dry pause. But she understood. Grace said, she wants Prescott heirs. Yes. I want children who don't feel like an inheritance. I know. He met her eyes. I'm going to make sure they don't. She believed him, which surprised her slightly. She noted the surprise and filed it away. They reached the final section, the one she had almost not included, the one she had added at midnight 3 days ago because it felt necessary and frightening in equal measure. There's a section about you specifically, she said, your access to information about their lives, school events, medical decisions, their particular interests and needs. I want you to have this. She paused, not just legally, because they deserve a father who actually knows them. He was quiet. I'm not inviting a relationship between us, she said, clearly, without ambiguity. What I'm inviting is a relationship between you and your children. Those are separate things, and I need them to stay separate. I understand, he said. I need you to actually understand, not agree to it tactically. She looked at him directly. This means showing up consistently and quietly and without drama for as long as it takes. Not grand gestures, not, she paused. You know what I mean. No private jet birthdays, he said. Exactly. Something that was almost humor moved across his face. Charlotte said the same thing. Grace raised an eyebrow. You know it was Charlotte. He nodded. She told me. Last week, we had a long conversation. Was it useful? It was excruciating, he said, which I believe means yes. She almost smiled. She kept it back. One more thing, she said. Information, not accusation. He nodded. I spent 5 years rebuilding from something that diminished me. I rebuilt this house, and this work, and this life. I did it alone, and I am genuinely proud of what I built. And I need you to understand that your arrival in my children's lives cannot mean the diminishment of what I built. Your money, your resources, your presence, none of it gets to make me invisible again, in any context, including parenting. He looked at her with the complete, full attention he had almost never given her in the marriage. I hear you, he said. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think I'm beginning to understand what I failed to see, he said. That is a different thing from having understood it before. I know that. He paused. But I hear you, Grace, and I will spend whatever time it takes making sure my children see their mother as the most capable, present, remarkable person in any room she walks into. Because that is who she is, whether I was capable of seeing it or not. The kitchen was very quiet. Grace held still. She would not cry in front of him. She did not. She picked up her pen. She signed the framework agreement. He signed it after her. Marcus would review it. Their attorneys would formalize it. But what they had signed tonight, at this particular table, was real in a way that legal documents rarely achieved. It was two people choosing to do better by their children than they had been able to do by each other. That was enough. That was honestly more than she had hoped for when she opened the door 3 weeks ago. She walked him to the door. On the porch, he turned. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Okay. Are you happy? Here, in this life?" She thought about it honestly. She did not give him a diplomatic answer. "Yes," she said. "I genuinely am." He nodded. Something released in his face. Relief, specifically. The relief of knowing someone you harmed is actually fully okay. Good, he said, so that matters to me. She said, "Good night, Elliot." He said, "Good night, Grace." She closed the door. She leaned against it for a moment. Then she went into the living room and sat on the floor, deliberately, consciously, because she wanted to be in her own space, on her own rug, in her own dark. She sat and breathed, not in fear, not in grief, in something that was slowly, certainly, unmistakably beginning to feel like resolution. I deserved better than what was. I built better than what was. And now, better is what I have. She got up. She went to bed. She slept through the night for the first time in 3 weeks. December came into Asheville all at once. One morning, Grace woke up, and the light was different. The ground was different. The season had changed while she was sleeping, the way seasons do. Not gradually, but decisively, between one day and the next. She was in the kitchen making cinnamon rolls from Dorothy's recipe, the recipe she had made every December since she was 12 years old, the one that required 2 rises and took most of a Saturday and filled the house with a smell that meant something she had never found a more precise word for than home. Sophie and Owen were allegedly helping. Sophie was narrating the process with the seriousness of a documentary about a very important culinary event. Owen had consumed a significant quantity of the filling and was conducting himself as if this had not occurred. Grace's phone chimed on the counter. A text from Elliot. "We still on for Sunday?" She typed back, "Yes, 2 p.m." Then she put the phone face down and went back to her rolls. This was the new normal. Texts about Sunday, arrangements made in advance, Elliot arriving on Sunday afternoons and staying for 2 hours, reading to Owen, submitting to Sophie's elaborate invented games with what appeared to be genuine patience. He had not been late once. Charlotte had driven up from Charleston for Thanksgiving. She had stayed at a hotel and spent the day with Grace and Dorothy and the twins and Renee. Renee had been suspicious of Charlotte for approximately 40 minutes. Then Charlotte had made a very specific joke about Elliot's understanding of board games, and Renee had laughed against her own intentions, and after that the day had been genuinely fine. Better than fine. The kind of Thanksgiving that adds to the memory rather than simply fulfilling the obligation of the calendar. Vivian Annie Prescott had not called since the journalist incident. She had sent a formal card in November. In her precisely formed handwriting, "I look forward to meeting the children at the appropriate time." Grace had left it on the counter for a while, then she put it in a drawer. One reckoning at a time. The paternity test results had come back 3 weeks ago. Of course they had. Of course the results were what they were always going to be. In a strange way, the formality of that confirmation settled something that had needed settling. The question that had floated in the air for 5 years had a form now, a document. It was real in every possible register. Marcus had closed the preliminary filings. The formal co-parenting agreement was signed in late November. Grace had a copy in the filing cabinet where documents lived. The drawer was for other things. Sophie tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, is this the right amount?" Grace looked at what Sophie was holding. "That is exactly the right amount," she said. Sophie beamed and dumped it into the bowl. Owen, without looking up from his corner of the counter, said, "She put too much." Sophie turned on him immediately. "I did not." "You did. I did exactly the right amount." Grace said that to be nice. Grace said, "Owen." Owen said, "It was a kind lie." Sophie stared at him. "What is a kind lie?" "It's when you say something isn't wrong because you don't want the person to feel bad." Sophie turned to Grace with enormous, deeply wronged eyes. Was it too much? Grace looked between her two children, Owen watching her steadily, curious and precise. Sophie waiting with her whole face, ready to feel whatever the answer required. She said, very honestly, "A little, but cinnamon rolls are always better when there's a little too much." Sophie recovered instantly. "See," she said to Owen, "better?" Owen considered this. "That's a different thing than right," he said. "It's better than right." How can better than right be better than right? Grace watched them debate. She was smiling. She didn't try to contain it this time. This was the house she had built. This was the conversation that happened in it. These were the people who woke up in it every morning. She punched down the dough. That afternoon, while the rolls were in their second rise, she sat at her drafting table. A new project. A large one. A historic home in Black Mountain that would require her full attention for a year. The owner, a woman named Harriet, who was 72 and had bought the house because she fell in love with its bones, had told Grace, "I just want it to feel like itself, like it knows who it is." Grace had written that down. She had thought about it often since. A house that knows who it is. She looked around her own studio, the corkboard with its layers, the drafting table with its particular worn edge where her wrist had rested for years, the window looking out at the backyard where the play set stood in December stillness. This house knew who it was. She thought, so do I. Finally, completely, I know exactly who I am. Not a wife, not a settlement agreement, not a secret, not a vindication or a cautionary tale or a woman defined by the worst year of her life. Grace Harmon, 38 years old, Asheville, North Carolina, interior designer who built spaces that knew themselves, daughter of Dorothy, who saw everything, friend of Renee, who said the true thing, mother of Sophie and Owen, who were the most irreplaceable people she had ever known, the woman who made impossible choices with imperfect information and did not let those choices define her as a victim, who survived and then, slowly, beyond survival, built something real. She drew for an hour. The cinnamon rolls came out of the oven. Dorothy arrived at 4. Because Dorothy always arrived when things came out of the oven, which Grace had long since decided was not coincidence. Renee arrived at 4:15. Renee always said she was just in the neighborhood, which was never true and always welcome. They ate cinnamon rolls at the kitchen table. All 5 of them. 3 generations arranged around Grace's particular table in Grace's particular kitchen in December. Sophie talking continuously, Owen making small, precise observations, Dorothy laughing at something Sophie said, Renee making the specific face she made when she was tasting something excellent and did not want to have to admit how excellent it was. Grace sat in the middle of all of it, warm, present, real. Not invisible, not diminished, not a complication or a relief or a number in a settlement. Not a secret in a photograph or a headline waiting to happen. Here. Fully, completely, irreducibly here. Later, after Dorothy and Renee had gone, after the twins were bathed and read to and settled, Grace stood at the kitchen window with the last of her coffee. The street outside was quiet. Someone a few houses down had already put up their Christmas lights. Red and white and soft gold against the early dark. She thought about 5 years ago. The bathroom floor at Renee's, the pregnancy test on the sink edge, the enormous, impossible, sufficient word, oh. She thought about what she had built since that moment. She thought, I would do some of it differently. I would be braver, some of it. I would ask more directly for what I needed earlier in the marriage. I would have found Marcus sooner. I would have let myself cry on the floor for more than 3 minutes. But I would not undo it. I would not undo a single morning of those 2 children. She drank her coffee. She watched the lights. Her phone chimed. Elliot. Sophie asked me today if I like rocks. I said I'm learning to. Grace looked at this for a long moment. She typed back, that's the right answer. 3 dots. Then, Owen told me that's a good start. She made a sound that was fully, completely a laugh. Unmanaged. Real. She put the phone down on the counter. She looked out the window. The night was cold and clear. The lights were on in her house. Her children were asleep upstairs with their purple nightlight and their stone collections and their drawings and their wholly, specifically, irreplaceably, themselves selves. She had been afraid, for a long time, that letting Elliot in meant losing what she had built. She understood now that the fear was the last thing she needed to put down. The door had been open all along. She had always known that. She just needed to choose to walk through it. Not running, not fleeing, not pushed, but arriving, deliberately, on her own terms, in her own time, here, home, fully, permanently, finally home.
The lessons this story leaves behind. We have come to the end of Grace's story, but before we go, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because this story was never really about a billionaire or a letter or a secret pregnancy. It was about something much simpler and much harder than any of that. It was about what it means to slowly disappear inside a life that looks perfectly fine from the outside, and what it takes to find your way back. The first lesson is this. You can be in a relationship with someone who never raises their voice, never says a cruel word, never does a single obvious, nameable wrong thing, and still lose yourself completely. Neglect does not have to be loud to be real. Absence does not have to be physical to do damage. If you have spent years feeling invisible to the person who was supposed to see you most clearly, that is not your imagination. That is not you being too sensitive. That is a real loss, and it deserves to be named. The second lesson is this. Decisions made in the dark are not automatically wrong decisions. Grace made a choice in the hardest moment of her life, with the information she had from the only position she could see from. Was it perfect? No. Did she know that herself? Yes. She carried the weight of its imperfection every single day. But she was not wrong to want her children to be unconditionally wanted. She was not wrong to want to build a life where they would never feel like complications. We do not have to defend every choice we have ever made to exhaustion. We just have to understand why we made it, own the parts that were about fear, and keep building from where we are now. The third lesson is this. The strongest thing Grace did in this entire story was not the confrontation in the conference room. It was not the framework she designed on her own terms. It was not the conversation at Harlow's Coffee. The strongest thing she did was sit on the floor of her own hallway alone with her back against the door and give herself exactly 3 minutes to fall apart and then get up and go back to the pasta water that was still boiling. Strength is not the absence of breaking. Strength is the returning, over and over, to the ordinary, necessary, beautiful work of your own life. The fourth lesson is this. The people who hold us together are not always the people we expect. Not the grand romantic gesture, not the dramatic rescue, but Renee, sitting on the bathroom floor for 15 minutes without saying a word. Dorothy, holding 2 cups of coffee at the door before anyone asked. Charlotte, making a phone call that was hard and necessary and late but real. The people who show up, quietly, consistently, without drama, are the ones worth holding on to. Find your Renee. Be someone's Renee. And the final lesson. The door was open all along. Grace spent years believing that surviving meant hiding, that safety meant smallness, that protecting her children meant protecting herself by becoming less visible, less present, less demanding of the space she deserved. But the door to a bigger life, a fuller life, a life where she was fully herself, was never locked from the outside. She was the one holding it closed. And the moment she stopped holding it closed, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, in small acts of courage, in honest conversations, in choosing clarity over comfort, everything changed. Not because Elliot changed, not because the circumstances changed, because she did. That is the only change that was ever in her hands, and it is the only change that was ever in yours. Whatever you are carrying right now, whatever decision you made in the dark that still wakes you up at 3 a.m, I want you to know this. You are not defined by the hardest moment of your life. You are defined by what you build after it. And there is still time. There is always still time. Final closing statement. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team with the intention of bringing meaning, healing, and genuine life lessons to every person who listens. Every story on this channel is built with care, not generated, not rushed, not assembled for algorithms. It is built for you, for the woman who needs to hear that survival is not the end of the story, that what comes after survival can be the most important chapter of all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That tells us something about who you are. See you in the next story.